The 1968 bet, when freedom taken the form of an old tractor. The era of promises. In 1968, the American Midwest was not only welcoming warm breezes, but also weathering a storm named Illusion across the vast cornfields of Iowa. People no longer gossiped about the weather or soil moisture. Instead, they spoke fervently of a new religion, expansion. Everywhere, the air was thick with the heavy scent of diesel and the fresh ink of new loan contracts. Amidst that frenzy, Thomas stood solitary by the weathered wooden fence of his family farm, his calloused hands gripping a rotting crossbar. At 24, his shoulders carried the entire estate left by his father. Yet, his dreams were being strangled by a grim reality. His father's old tractor had breathed its last breath the previous season, leaving Thomas to face hundreds of acres of parched land waiting to be tilled. He stood there, a young man with a will of steel, but a pocket so empty he could hear the wind whistling through it. In the town center, machinery dealerships rose like fortresses of modernity. The latest tractor models stood in long rows, the forest green of John Deere and the vibrant red of International Harvester gleaming under the sun, looking like steel monsters waiting for their servants. Banks were no longer cold, distant buildings. They flung their doors wide, rolled out red carpets, and welcomed farmers like heroes. Why break your back on scrap metal from the World War era when you can own the power of 100 horses with just a stroke of a pen? That question from the bank manager was nothing less than a sweet curse. They weren't just selling machinery. They were selling the illusion that debt was a pair of wings. Thomas felt the crushing pressure every day as bright red promotional flyers dropped into his mailbox like cards of destiny, urging him to bet his future on a single signature. The height of the drama occurred on a sweltering afternoon when Mr. Miller, a neighbor who always looked down on Thomas as a backward kid, loomed into view. The roar of a diesel engine rumbled like thunder, tearing through the quiet sky. Miller sat perched high upon a brand new John Deere 4020, so polished that Thomas could see his own weary face reflected on the hood. "Look at this, Thomas," Miller shouted over the roaring engine, his face flushed red with excitement. "The bank just gave me another loan to snatch up the entire western plot. Sign that paper, kid. Don't let yourself be buried with your father's pile of rust. The era of manpower, Iove, now is the era of credit." Miller's tractor revved, belching out a cloud of jet black smoke that engulfed Thomas like a final insult. Miller had locked in a 10-year loan, a figure that could buy a man's entire life. But to him at that moment, it was merely a number on a piece of paper. He believed he had conquered the future. Thomas stood amidst the acrid smoke, watching the silhouette of the 4020 fade into the distance. His heart pounded in his chest. On one side was the temptation of a cushioned seat, power steering, and the cheers of the town. On the other side was solitude, hunger, and an old belief: if you don't own it, it will soon own you. The dawn of 1968 was brilliant, but it was also cruel. The bet had been placed. Miller had chosen wings made of paper. As for Thomas, he turned his back on the glittering aura of the new machines and trudged into the darkness of his workshop, where only old iron blocks and a reckless plan were beginning to take shape. The silent choice. The atmosphere in the heartland at the end of April 1968 was not only thick with the scent of damp earth after the rain, but also burning with an invisible pressure. It was the pressure of change. Throughout the town's coffee shops, farmers no longer discussed soil, pH levels, or weather forecasts. They spoke fervently of credit agreements. To them, Debt was no longer a burden, but a kind of miracle fuel to fly into the future. In the midst of that whirlwind, Thomas stood solitary, like a small island in the ocean. At 24, he carried his father's legacy on his shoulders, a farm standing on the threshold of life and death. Thomas understood that without a tractor, he would lose everything. But he also understood something that the credit frenzy had blinded others to. One wrong signature could turn ancestral land into bank property overnight. Two paths appeared before him, clear and ruthless as a judicial sentence. The first path led to the bustling John Deere dealership in the town center. There, the latest tractor models stood in long rows, their forest green, paint glistening under the sun like precious gems. Sterling, the bank manager with polished leather shoes and an eternal smile, had come all the way to Thomas's farm. He stood in the middle of the yard, looking at the old stable with a gaze of contempt before holding out a thick stack of documents. "Listen, Thomas," Sterling said, his voice as sweet as honey. "You're a capable young man. Don't waste your youth breaking your back on these lands. With just one signature, the most powerful, for 1020, in the region will be here tomorrow morning. 10 years of installments, the interest is just pocket change compared to the profits you'll reap. Do you want to be a leader, or do you want to be buried with your forefather's pile of rust?" Thomas looked at the contract. He saw the endless terms, the convoluted interest rates winding like ropes waiting to be knotted. He reached into his pocket and touched a crumpled wad of small bills, $800. The result of 1,125 days of grueling labor, skimping on food and clothes, saving every penny from digging ditches for hire to hauling freight in the dead of winter. "Thank you, Sterling," Thomas replied, his voice low but steely. "But I don't have the habit of signing for things I can't pay for with my own sweat immediately." Sterling sneered, withdrawing the papers. "Well then, good luck with your pile of junk. Don't come running to beg me when the bank reclaims your land next year." That very afternoon, Thomas decided to take the second path. He drove his battered truck to Old Barney's scrapyard deep in the valley. There, lying under a rotted tarp and a pile of old tires, was a 1950 International Harvester Farmall. It wasn't just old, it looked like a forgotten corpse. The once legendary red paint had been eaten to the core by rust, looking like the color of dried blood. A long crack ran along the engine block, and the mechanical parts were seized tight by decades of caked grease. "You're crazy, son," he said. "Chintobak. This thing has been here since after the World War. The engine is dead. The transmission is shredded. You'd be better off throwing your money into the river than buying this heap of scrap." Thomas didn't answer. He knelt in the mud, reached under the machine, and felt the cold grain of the steel. He saw the carburetor was only clogged, and most importantly, the chassis was still straight, a frame built to survive any storm. He pulled out the crumpled wad of cash and placed it on Barney's filthy table. "I'm buying it. Right now." As Thomas's truck sluggishly towed the rusted Farmall toward the farm gate, Miller, the neighbor, who always viewed Thomas as a backward kid, was already waiting. Miller leaned against his gleaming John Deere for 1020, beer in hand, laughing loudly. Miller stepped forward, using the toe of his expensive leather shoe to kick the Farmall's cracked tire. A dull thud echoed, full of disdain. "Hey, Thomas. You bought this thing to farm or to sell for scrap back to old Barney?" Miller laughed, his voice echoing across the fields. "I thought you were smarter than your father, but turns out you're more delusional than the old man." Thomas silently unhooked the tow chain, sweat beginning to stream down his sun-darkened face. He replied, his voice unwavering, "It might be trash in your eyes, Miller, but it's mine. Every single bolt on this machine carries my name, not the bank's." Miller stepped closer, the pungent smell of beer mixing with the acrid smoke from his new machine. He pointed toward his magnificent green tractor. "Look at this. This is the future. I have a cushioned seat, air conditioning, and the power of 90 war horses. While you're struggling to plow 1 acre with this iron coffin, I'll have done 10. You're killing your father's farm, you coward." Thomas stopped and slowly raised his head. His eyes locked onto Miller, a cold gaze that made the older man flinch. Thomas wiped the grease onto his jeans and spoke every word deliberately. "You call me a coward because I won't sign my own death warrant. Mr. Miller, you don't own that machine. You're just renting it from Sterling for the price of your soul over the next 10 years. When the harvests fail, and believe me, the law of the land is that there are seasons of plenty and seasons of ruin. That air-conditioned seat won't help you sleep any better when the debt collector knocks." Miller turned red, the veins in his neck bulging. "Failed harvests. You cursing me now? The bank says the economy is only going up. You're just a dirt-poor brat trying to act noble. Let's see if your freedom iron even starts, or if it sits here as a headstone for this farm." Miller threw his beer can to the ground, crushed it under his heel, and climbed onto his John Deere. He revved the engine, belching a cloud of jet-black smoke that engulfed Thomas before he roared away arrogantly. Thomas stood silent in the acrid smoke. He turned to look at the farmer, old reliable. He knew the real war began now. For the next 48 hours straight, Thomas did not sleep. He used a blowtorch to melt bolts that had been seized for decades. He used his bare hands to scrape out oil sludge as thick as pitch from the fuel tank. His hands were a bloody mess of cuts from sharp steel, but he did not stop. On the second night, under the flickering light of an oil lamp, the Miller farm was still buzzing with music celebrating new debt. Thomas stood before the farmer. This was the moment of truth. He took the hand crank, pouring all the strength of his youth into his trembling shoulders. He turned it hard once. Total silence. He turned it a second time. A dry, hollow grunt echoed, then died out. From the distance, Miller's laughter seemed to linger in the wind. "Give it up." Thomas let out a roar, funneling all his resentment, hope, and family honor into the third turn. Boom! An earth-shattering explosion ripped through the night. The farmer shuddered, spitting a jet of pitch-black smoke straight into the air. The 4-cylinder engine began to roar steady, powerful, like the heartbeat of a giant awakening after 1,000 years' sleep. Layers of rust and dust were vibrated off the body of the machine. Thomas stood there, his face smeared with grease and blood, but a defiant smile broke across his lips. He jumped onto the cold iron driver's seat and looked toward the headlights of Miller's house in the distance. That night, in the darkness of the shed, Thomas gently used an oil-soaked rag to wipe his own blood off the hood. He had chosen freedom. Miller had chosen a glossy piece of debt, while Thomas had found a loyal companion. The bet of his life had begun with grease on his hands. And he knew that true reliability never lay in a new coat of paint, but in the strength of things that had paid their debt to life in full. The dawn of 1968 was rising, brilliant and threatening. But Thomas was no longer afraid. He had old reliable, and more importantly, he remained the sole master of himself. The storm arrives. The 1970s swept across the heartland like a brilliant but illusory golden dream. It was an era of slogans like "Go big or get out," under the Nixon and Carter administrations. American farmers were taught that the world was hungry and their land was a gold mine. Commodity prices skyrocketed, and to meet that demand, banks launched an unprecedented credit campaign. They turned debts into medals of glory. During those 10 years, Miller's farm transformed into a wonder of modernity. Miller was no longer the mud-stained farmer Thomas once knew. He was now like an executive, sitting in an air-conditioned tractor cab, adjusting a stereo system and looking down at the fields through tinted glass. Every 2 years, Miller would sign a new contract to upgrade machinery and buy more land at exorbitant prices. He borrowed to pay off debt, using one piece of land to mortgage another, believing the torrent of currency would never run dry. Every time he drove his brand new John Deere past Thomas's fence, Miller would blare his horn incessantly, mocking his neighbor who was still wrestling with a prehistoric hunk of farmel iron. But Thomas remained silent, like a pebble in a stream. For 10 years, Old Reliable had become his most loyal life partner. He still had to breathe dust, endure the scorching sun, and suffer backaches after every day of plowing, but he possessed one thing Miller had lost: peace of mind. When night fell, Thomas didn't have to calculate interest rates. He didn't startle at the sight of a bank car turning into town. Every inch of land Thomas cultivated, though not as productive as Miller's, yielded corn that belonged entirely to him. He didn't share his sweat with any bank executive on Wall Street. 1978 struck like a fatal blow. To combat skyrocketing inflation, the U.S. Federal Reserve suddenly tightened monetary policy. Bank interest rates, which Miller thought would always be stable, began to soar like a malignant fever. 12%, 15%, then hitting an insane 21%. At the same time, the dark shadow of politics descended. The grain embargo against the Soviet Union caused corn and soybean prices to go into a freefall. Overnight, farmers who were once considered paper millionaires suddenly realized the land they stood upon was not worth half the debt they carried. The tide had receded, leaving the heartland barren and in pain. The drama reached its peak on a grey October afternoon. Thomas was standing on his porch, holding a cup of black coffee, looking out at the trail. A convoy of black cars trudged into Miller's farm. Leading them was Sterling, the bank manager Thomas had rejected 10 years prior. This time, Sterling no longer wore a sugar-coated smile. His face was cold and sharp as a scalpel. Thomas stepped closer to the fence. He saw Miller rush out from the porch, hair disheveled, face haggard, and eyes bloodshot. Miller held an old shotgun, the barrel trembling as it pointed towards Sterling. "Stay back. Take one more step and I'll shoot." Miller screamed, his voice shattering in the cold wind. "This is my land. You people have sucked me dry for 10 years already." Sterling stood still, hands in his coat pockets, without a hint of fear. He looked at Miller with the contempt reserved for someone who had outlived their usefulness. "Put the gun down, Miller. It won't pay the check that's 6 months overdue. You don't own anything here. Even the roof over your head has belonged to the bank since last autumn." Thomas held his breath. Esau Martha, Miller's wife, ran out to embrace her husband, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please, Sterling. We'll pay. Just give us one more season." But Sterling simply signaled to the burly men behind him. They weren't farmers. They were recovery agents. One man stepped toward the farm gate, holding a wooden sign and a large hammer. The thwack, thwack, thwack sounded chilling in the quiet space. The sign revealed the fateful words, "Foreclosure auction, Each hammer blow into the wooden post was like a nail driven into the coffin of Miller's career. The collapse did not stop there. The recovery agents headed straight for the barn. They used heavy iron chains to hook the axle of the newest John Deere tractor, the machine Miller once considered his crown. As the tractor's engine roared while being dragged onto the truck, Miller collapsed into the mud. He dropped the gun, burying his face in his hands, weeping like a child. It was the cry of a man realizing he had spent his whole life building a castle on sand. And now, the wave of debt had washed it all away. Sterling walked past the fence where Thomas stood silent as a bronze statue next to the rusted farmel. Sterling stopped and rolled down the car window. He looked at Thomas's dark, red block of iron, then at his grease-stained hands. "Do you see it now, Thomas?" Sterling said bitterness. 10 years ago, you bought this scrap metal for $800. Now, it's the only thing in this valley with real value, because I don't own it. Thomas looked straight at Sterling, his gaze unwavering. "You're wrong, Sterling. Its value doesn't lie in whether you own it or not. Its value lies in the fact that it never betrays its owner to follow a man with money like you." Sterling was silent for a long time, then he signaled the convoy to move. The truck carrying Miller's pride lumbered away, leaving behind a thick screen of black smoke and a mournful silence. Thomas stepped toward Miller's fence. He saw his neighbor still sitting there in the mud, eyes empty, watching the smoke. Miller looked up and saw Thomas and the farmel. A withered smile appeared on his lips. "You were right, Thomas," Miller whispered, his voice hoarse. "Rusty iron is still iron. But papers are just trash when the winter wind arrives." Thomas didn't say a single mocking word. He understood that life's punishment was already enough. He turned back to Old Reliable and climbed onto the cold iron seat. He took the hand crank, funneling the power of freedom into his arms. First turn, the groan of compressed air. Second turn, the dry clashing of metal. Third turn, boom. The thunderous explosion ripped through the desperate atmosphere of that October afternoon. The farmel spat out a plume of vibrant grey smoke. The four-cylinder engine roared rhythmically, powerful and proud. Thomas shifted into gear, the teeth engaging firmly. He began to drive his 1950 tractor to plow the first furrow of the most difficult season in history. That night, the entire heartland was shrouded in darkness. The Miller house had no lights because the electricity had been cut for non-payment. But under the pale yellow headlights of the farmel, Thomas continued to work tirelessly. He was no longer a poor farmer in the eyes of others. He was the sole survivor. The bet of 1968 had been settled. The man with no debt was the true master of the earth. The tide had receded, and only the iron blocks that had paid their debt to life, like Old Reliable, had enough strength to pull their master through the storm. The last one standing. The spring of 1980 did not bring Grinch. It brought destruction. A historic flood swept through the Heartland Valley, turning the once fertile cornfields into a vast lake of sludge. This was the final knife blow to farms, already gasping for air under the weight of debt. When the waters receded, they left behind a layer of thick, suffocating mud that swallowed everything in its path. The brand new tractors of the surrounding large farms reliant on primitive electronics and complex starters now stood dead in the mire. The more they tried to start the engines, the tighter the mud gripped the sensitive circuit boards, turning $100,000 machines into gleaming piles of scrap metal. In the midst of that desperate scene, the lights at Thomas's farm still flickered on at 5 a.m. The sound of splashing through the muck echoed, Thomas stood there, water up to his knees, looking at Old Reliable, which was buried in mud up to its axles. He had no cabin to block the skin-cutting cold, no power steering to combat the monstrous drag of the sludge. But Thomas had one thing no modern tractor possessed: mechanical purity. Thomas knew that if he didn't sow the seeds in time, the entire region would starve in the winter, and the banks would have an excuse to wipe the name Heartland off the map forever. He approached the farmall, iron hand crank in hand. The freezing mud clung to his legs like the hands of a death-ridden ghost, trying to drag him into the abyss. The dramatic climax exploded as Thomas poured all the strength of a man with nothing left to lose into the crank. First turn, metal shrieked painfully in the thick mud. Second turn, Thomas slipped, falling headlong into the pitch-black mire. Sterling's mocking laughter seemed to echo somewhere in the wind. "You can't beat the times, Thomas." But Thomas let out a roar cry from the depths of his chest. He stood up, face caked in mud, with only his eyes burning with iron will. He used his entire body as a lever, funneling all his resentment and love for the land into the third turn. Boom! A plume of jet-black smoke shot straight into the rain. The four-cylinder engine roared like an insulted beast. The layers of mud clinging to the engine block were vibrated off. Old Reliable had been resurrected. The entire valley watched, in awe as that rusted, dark red tractor crawled through the deepest bogs. Without power steering, Thomas's arms bulged until his muscles seemed ready to burst as he fought the iron steering wheel. Every inch of land he crossed was a victory over despair. Meanwhile, Sterling the bank manager stood on the high asphalt road, helplessly watching his client's modern machinery being buried alive. He waved to Thomas, his voice trembling. "Thomas, save the West Farm. If you can plow that plot, I'll wipe the tax debt for the whole region." Thomas didn't even look back. He didn't do it for Sterling. He did it for the promise made to his father, for the neighbors who had lost everything. Throughout 72 hours of horror, Thomas and the farmall did not rest for a single minute. Its crisp, rhythmic engine fire was the only sound sustaining hope for the entire valley. Thomas drove through the night under the flickering, dim yellow headlights, looking like a god of earth and stone stitching back the wounds of the world. When the sun rose on the fourth day, the desolate fields of the Miller family and 3 surrounding farms had been completely tilled. Thomas slumped over the steering wheel from exhaustion, his hands bloody and swollen, but he had done it. He was the sole survivor on the face of the earth after the Great Flood. Weeks later, when the ground had dried, Sterling came to Thomas's house with a dazed expression. He carried the land titles of those who had given up. "They're all gone, Thomas," Sterling said, hoarse. "No one wants to come back to this mud hole. The bank wants to sell this land off cheaply to recover capital. Do you want to buy it back?" Thomas looked out at the acres he had just saved. He pulled out a rusted iron box filled with cash, clean money untainted by a single drop of debt. "I'll buy it," Thomas replied, "but not to get rich. I'm buying it to ensure that from now on, no man in a suit can ever set foot here to hang a foreclosure sign again." 10 years later, Thomas had become a legend in the heartland. He owned the largest acreage, but still drove that 1950 farmall. People called him the king of the dirt, but he only saw himself as a guardian. The scene concludes emotionally as Caleb, his grandson, watches Thomas wipe new scratches on the body of the old tractor. "Grandpa, why don't you buy a new machine? You have enough money to buy a whole fleet of John Deeres." Thomas lifted Caleb onto the driver's seat, pointing to the iron steering wheel polished smooth by 3 decades of sweat. "Do you see this dent, Thomas pointed to the hood. "That's a scar from the Great Flood of '80. If I had been sitting in an air-conditioned cab with an electronic circuit board back then, we would have lost this farm. This machine doesn't have a computer to tell it what to do. It only has your heart and its own mechanical bloodline." Thomas looked toward the horizon, where modern tractors were operating busily in other regions' machines, whose owners were still holding their breath every month, waiting for bank interest rates. "Caleb, remember this. Debt is a storm always lurking outside the door. And the best tractor is not the fastest one, but the one that belongs to you 100% when the storm hits. Never sell your soul for borrowed glitz." Thomas started the engine. The boom of the third turn still echoed, powerful and full of freedom. Grandfather and grandson rode together toward the sunset on the hunk of iron that had become the soul of an entire land. Thomas had won, not by racing against time, but by standing firm like an old oak, even as the tide of debt washed away an entire generation. He was no longer the timid kid. He was a living legacy. The last one standing to remind the world. True, freedom always carries the scent of engine oil and the color of rust from things that have paid their debt to life in full. The legacy of iron. Afternoons in the heartland always carry an amber hue, a light that feels as if it were distilled from the ripening cornfields. Thomas sat on his porch, his hands trembling with age-onset rheumatism as he gently touched his breast pocket. There, he always kept a black and white photograph, yellowed and torn at the corners, an image of his father standing beside the farm on the day it was brand new. His father had passed away when the farm was drowning in debt, and his final words were not a command to be wealthy, but a plea: "Don't let them take this land away, Thomas." Land is our family's honor. Decades had passed, and Thomas had fulfilled that promise in the most extraordinary way. Down in the yard, Caleb was busily using an old cotton towel to wipe dust off the hood of Old Reliable. The boy did it with a sense of reverence, as if performing a religious rite. Watching the scene, Thomas felt his eyes sting with tears. He suddenly realized that the legacy he was leaving behind was not thousands of acres of land, but the profound respect for labor and the freedom that this tractor represented. At that moment, an old, dusty car pulled up to the gate. Frail old men of the heavily handstep, how with gold etoile. Years of drifting through menial labor in the city had withered the man who was once so arrogant. Miller walked into the yard, his gaze lingering for a long time on the bright red farmel. He tremblingly reached out, a thin hand to touch the block of iron and steel, then looked up at Thomas, sitting on the porch. "Is it still here, Thomas?" Miller asked, his voice shaking like dry leaves. "It's still waiting for you to visit, Miller," Thomas replied, his voice warm and forgiving. Miller burst into tears. Belated tears rolled down the wrinkled cheeks of a man who had nothing left. "I used to laugh at you. I called you timid, but look, Thomas, you kept everything. As for me, I traded my family, my ancestral land for a dream made of paper. I ran too fast, only to end up with nowhere to return to." Thomas stood up, walked down the wooden stairs, and embraced the old friend's shoulders. "You didn't lose everything, Miller. Your West plot, I still keep it under your family name. I have plowed it every year with this farmel. I've been waiting for the day your children were strong enough to take it back. A farmer's land must belong to the farmer, not the bank." Miller sank to his knees beside the massive tire of the farmel, sobbing. Thomas's compassion was more powerful than any mechanical force. Amidst the fading golden sunlight, To old men, one who stood until the end and one who returned after losing his way stood beside the massive iron and steel that had witnessed the many upheavals of life. Thomas looked over at Caleb, his grandson, who was standing there confused, watching the two old men. He smiled and led Caleb closer to the tractor. "Caleb, do you see the scar on my hand?" Thomas pointed to a long, faded scar on his palm. "This is the wound from the night I started this farm in the Great Flood of 80. At that time, I was in so much pain I wanted to let go. But every time I looked at this iron, I remembered your great-grandfather. This machine is not just oil and steel. It holds my sweat, Miller's tears, and the souls of those who fell to protect this land." He lifted Caleb up and placed him in the driver's seat. This time, Thomas didn't tell Caleb to look at the vast fields. Instead, he told the boy to press his ear against the cooling engine block. "Do you hear anything?" "I hear the wind blowing through the iron vents, Grandpa." "That is the breath of the earth, Caleb. This machine is the bridge between us and Mother Earth. One day, when I am no longer sitting on this porch, every time you start this farm, you will find me beside you. You will see that as long as you have no debt, as long as you are the master of your own two hands, then no matter how long the winter is, the sun will always rise on our farm." Thomas slowly pulled an old key and an iron hand crank, polished smooth by human touch, from his pocket. He placed them into Caleb's small hands. "I pass this freedom to you. Hold on to it as you would your own breath." The sun began to set behind the rows of corn, staining the heartland sky deep red. Thomas sat back in his rocking chair, watching Caleb try to imitate him by cleaning the tractor. An unprecedented sense of peace spread through his chest. The legacy of iron is not an expensive machine, but a lesson in endurance, in agriculture, as in life. The one who stays the longest is not the one with the most modern equipment, but the one with the most steadfast heart and a completely free soul. The 1950 farmer stood there, silent and majestic, under the crescent moon. It had paid its debt to life, saved a family, and was now ready to protect a new generation. Thomas's story came to a close, but the boom of the third turn would echo forever in the valley, reminding anyone who passed by, gold may lose its value, debt papers may burn to ash, but iron and earth are always loyal to those who dare to live by their own strength. Thomas closed his eyes, a gentle smile appearing on his lips. He had won the bet of his life. And out there, the wind over the cornfield sounded like a symphony, ushering a legend back to the great Mother Earth. Thomas's wager in 1868 wasn't just about a tractor. It was a lifetime's gamble to protect his freedom. In a world that is always rushing after shiny things and borrowed debts, the story of Old Reliable reminds us that true value doesn't lie in speed, but in whether or not you truly own your own life. If you found this story meaningful, please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to join us on this journey back to the timeless values of the past.